They never saw it coming. Not the scientists, not the generals, not even the quiet ones who had learned to listen before they spoke. Humanity had always believed its end would be loud, something fiery, chaotic, maybe even noble. But when it began, it was quiet, subtle, like a breath held too long. And by the time they realized what was happening, it had already passed the point of being stopped. The sky didn't burn. The oceans didn't boil. It was something else entirely. They called it the silence. It started in the deep sky listening posts, places so remote even the birds avoided them. Technicians would stare at screens for hours, listening for whispers in the dark. Most of the time it was static. Sometimes it was a lonely ping from a satellite left spinning years ago. But one night the stars went quiet. Not dark, quiet. As if someone had reached across the universe and gently put a finger to their lips. At first they thought it was interference. A system glitch. But it wasn't just one station. It was all of them. Every signal out there, every hum, every pulse, every signature of distant life, stopped. Like someone had pulled the plug on the galaxy. The world didn't panic at first. How could it? Nothing had exploded. No buildings had collapsed. Life went on. People still went to work. Kids still played in the streets. But the silence spread, and the ones who paid attention knew what it meant. Something was coming. Something they couldn't see yet. But it was out there. Moving. Closer. And then the dreams began. They started with the children. Soft, strange things. Stories of black suns and silver voices. Of planets made of mirrors. Most adults didn't notice. Not until the dreams turned violent. Not until the screaming started. Hospitals filled with kids who wouldn't wake up. Some wouldn't stop crying. Some wouldn't stop laughing. One girl drew the same image over and over. A tall figure standing in a field of bones, holding something that looked like a star in its hand. That's when the military got involved. Quietly, of course. No one wanted a panic. But word got out like it always does. And it didn't help when the satellites started going offline. One after another. Clean drops. No debris, no signals. Just gone. As if they'd never been there at all. People started to leave the cities. Just a few at first. Then more. The roads choked with caravans. Rural towns swelled with strangers. The power grids began to flicker. And still the stars stayed quiet. That's when they sent out the ships. 3 of them. Manned by the best humanity had left. Scientists, engineers, diplomats. The brightest minds and the bravest hearts. Their mission wasn't war. It was contact. Understanding. Maybe negotiation if it came to that. They never came back. The transmissions from the first ship were garbled. The last thing they said was, "We are not alone." But we're not what they expected. Then silence. The second ship lasted less than a day. The third, no one knows what happened to the third. And so humanity did what it had always done when faced with the unknown. It prepared for the worst. But this time no weapon would be enough. No bunker deep enough. Because this wasn't just an invasion. It wasn't just about territory or power. It was a test. One that humanity didn't know it had already started failing. And in the middle of it all, before the wars, before the sky tore open and the last cities fell, there was a man standing on a quiet hill, staring up at the stars. He wasn't a soldier. Not a scientist. Just someone who had lost too much already. A father, a brother, a man with shaking hands and heavy eyes. He didn't look special. But sometimes the smallest spark is all it takes to start a fire. He didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change because of him. Because in a galaxy that had forgotten what fear was, he was about to remind them. Not with guns. Not with ships. But with the one thing they couldn't understand. The one thing they couldn't break. What made humanity dangerous was never its strength. It was its heart. The man's name didn't matter. Not yet. Not to the world and not even to himself. Names were something you earned back when you had time to reflect. Time to remember who you were before everything fell apart. All he had now were memories he didn't want and a silence that stretched inside him longer than the one swallowing the sky. He had lost his wife to the early stages of the silence. Not because of anything violent. No explosion. No creature bursting through a door. Just nothing. One night she didn't wake up. Her body still warm, her face peaceful, like she'd simply stepped into a dream and decided not to return. There was no cause the doctors could agree on. Neurological failure, they wrote. But they knew nothing. No one did. And so, with her gone, he wandered. At first on foot. Then in an old truck that he fixed up with parts stripped from abandoned vehicles. He didn't talk much. Didn't sleep much either. But he saw things. Strange things. And the more he saw, the more he knew something was wrong with the world. Wrong in a way no scientist could put in a report or bottle in a test tube. People were changing. Some became still, too still, sitting in their homes or cars like statues. Others moved constantly, never stopping, walking in circles until their feet bled. Some spoke in whispers to things no one else could see. Some stopped speaking altogether. But there were always the same words written on their walls, carved into trees, scratched into the dirt. They are watching. Who were they? No one knew. No one who said it lived long enough to explain. He passed through a town once where every clock had stopped at the same moment. 3:17 a.m. exactly. Even the digital ones. People there moved like they were in a dream, slow, smiling, not seeing him. He left that place quickly. But something followed him from there. At night he began hearing tapping on the roof of his truck. Just once. Then silence. Sometimes it was on the window. Sometimes it was inside the cab just beneath the dash. But when he looked there was nothing. He stopped sleeping entirely after the third night. That's when he began keeping the journal. It was a battered little notebook, the kind school kids used to write spelling words. He didn't write much. Just fragments. Glimpses. A place, a sound, a face in a dream. And one phrase he circled over and over, carving it into the paper until it tore. We are not alone. But we are not what they expected. He didn't know where he'd heard it. Only that it felt true. And it felt like a warning. Then came the storm. It wasn't rain. Not at first. It was wind, hot, dry, and constant, as if the world were holding its breath and didn't know how to let go. It blew across the plains for hours, moaning through empty buildings and rattling every loose bolt on his truck. The sky turned a strange shade of orange. Static crackled through his radio, playing half snippets of voices that didn't sound human. And then the lights came. They weren't ships. He was sure of that. Not in the way people imagine them. No saucers, no thrumming engines. These were shapes. Geometries that twisted when you looked at them too long. Lines that bent in ways that broke your brain if you tried to follow them. They hovered in the clouds, sometimes flickering, sometimes pulsing. One of them stared at him. He felt it, not in his eyes but in his chest, in the parts of him that still remembered what love and fear used to feel like. And then it vanished. Just like that. But from that night on the dreams changed. He began seeing people. Or what used to be people. Their eyes were wrong. Their smiles didn't match their faces. And always, they whispered the same thing before vanishing. Not ready. Not ready. Not ready. What weren't they ready for? That question dug into him like glass beneath the skin. In a broken town not far from the Rockies, he finally found someone else who still seemed awake. A woman with sunburnt skin and oil-stained hands. She was fixing a radio tower by herself, surrounded by maps pinned to the walls with knives. She didn't flinch when he walked into the room. You hear it too, she said. Not a question. He nodded. She offered him water, then pointed at the largest map. Red dots covered it, spreading like infection across the globe. Every one of those is a silent zone, she said. Dead signals. No power. No sound. No movement. He stared at it for a long time. There's a pattern, she added. They're not random. They're circling something. Like sharks. What's in the center? She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Nothing. Pause. Or maybe, she said, everything. He stayed with her for 3 days. Learned her name, though it's lost now, like so many others. She showed him how to track the pulses, the faint electrical echoes that came and went like sonar from deep space. They weren't natural. They repeated too perfectly. Almost like a language. Someone's scanning us, she told him. Looking for something. Or someone. He didn't ask who. She gave him a transmitter, small enough to wear under his coat. If they find you, she said, I want to know what happens. He asked her what she meant by they. Her answer came slow. Whatever's coming, they've been here before. A long time ago. Maybe longer than we've existed. He didn't press her. The next morning he woke to silence. The kind that doesn't belong in nature. No wind. No birds. No ticking from the little watch she kept on the shelf. He found her upstairs. Eyes open. Not breathing. And something scratched into the floor beside her hand. Too late. He buried her behind the tower. Didn't say anything. Just stood there a while and let the wind finally come back. And then he left. He didn't know where he was going. Only that something was pulling him. Like a thread tied around his ribs, tugging gently but firmly. And the closer he got to wherever it led, the stranger the world became. He passed entire highways full of cars, engines still warm but no one inside. He found a town where time ran backwards for 5 minutes every hour. He tested it. watched his watch reverse, watched a bird uncrash into a window. Then it all snapped back to normal like nothing happened. The rules were breaking. And whatever was behind it, it was watching. Not from the sky. From inside. He kept walking. Every mile felt heavier than the last, not just from the weight of his pack or the ache in his legs, but something else, something unseen. It pressed down on him like the atmosphere was thickening, like the world itself didn't want him getting any closer to whatever was out there. The thread in his chest pulled stronger. He passed broken cities, silent suburbs where swings moved without wind. He saw dogs sitting quietly in yards, staring at the sky as if waiting for some command. Once, in a tunnel beneath an old mountain road, he heard voices calling his name. He'd never told anyone his name. He didn't answer. In a valley once used as farmland, he came across a field of mirrors. Hundreds of them stuck upright in the dirt like tombstones. Each one was slightly warped. None showed his reflection. But every mirror had a crack running through the middle, and deep within the crack was movement, slow, pulsing like something breathing on the other side. He didn't stay long. That night the dreams returned, worse than before. He saw a machine the size of a moon. It wasn't built by humans. Its surface writhed with strange carvings, and its core glowed like a dying star. Around it floated beings, not with bodies but with forms. Energy shaped by intention. Intelligence so sharp it hurt to look at. They weren't just watching Earth. They were remembering it. As if they'd seen it before. As if they were comparing what it had become with what it was supposed to be. And it had failed. When he woke up he was sweating through his coat. The sky above him had changed. The stars were wrong, shifted. As if the whole planet had tilted in its sleep. He kept moving. For weeks, maybe longer. He stopped counting the days. Stopped trying to find food. It just appeared when he needed it. Water too. A river that hadn't been on the map. A patch of berries growing in snow. Someone, or something, wanted him alive. That scared him more than dying. He started writing again. The journal became more than fragments. More than just fear. He wrote about the people he remembered. About her, his wife, how her laugh used to light up the coldest mornings. About the world before the silence. Not because it helped, but because it felt like someone might need to remember, if this all ended in fire. And then one night he heard music. Not the hum of radios or static echoes. Real music. A piano, soft and distant, playing a melody he didn't recognize but somehow knew by heart. He followed it. It led him to a cabin half buried in snow, tucked at the edge of a pine forest where the trees were too straight and the bark felt like glass. Smoke rose from the chimney. A light glowed inside. And for the first time in months he felt something close to warmth. He knocked. No answer. He pushed the door open, slow and careful. Inside sat a child, no older than 10. Alone. Playing the piano like she'd done it all her life. Her hands moved with eerie calm. Her eyes never left the keys. The room was clean. Too clean. No dust. No signs of struggle or survival. Just stillness. He stepped closer. The moment he crossed the threshold, the music stopped. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wrong. Not evil. Not alien. Just too deep. Like looking into a tunnel with no end. You took longer than expected, she said. He froze. Who are you? She smiled faintly. A door. That didn't make sense. But deep down, something in him understood. She wasn't lying. He tried again. What do you want from me? Her fingers hovered over the keys. Not me, she said. They do. They've been searching. We thought you were gone. Who? The ones who built the test. The ones who left it running after they lost interest. His breath caught. You mean, all this? She nodded once. This planet. This species. The others like it. It's all part of a sequence. A simulation for finding something better. But most species break. You didn't. He stepped back. This isn't real? She shook her head. No. But you are. He stared at her, trying to understand. You said you're a door, he said. A door to what? To them, she said. And then the walls melted. Not with heat. Not with flame. With light. The cabin dissolved. The snow vanished. The trees folded into themselves like they'd never been real. And he was floating. Not falling, not flying, just suspended in something thicker than air but lighter than water. In front of him stood a figure made of stars. It had no face. No voice. Just presence. But he heard it. Not in his ears. In his bones. Why do you fight to survive? It asked. He couldn't speak. Couldn't move. The voice continued. You are fragile. Short-lived. Primitive. Your wars are endless. Your minds are bound by fear. What makes you believe you deserve to continue? He didn't answer. He felt. He remembered his wife's laughter. The boy in the gas station who gave him a bottle of water and didn't ask questions. The woman at the tower, still trying to make sense of the world even when it had stopped making sense. He thought of every child who still played in broken streets. Every parent who carried their family through fire. Every stranger who shared hope even when they had none to spare. And in the silence he pushed back. Not with words. With memory. With meaning. The stars around him trembled. The figure seemed to hesitate. You feel pain, it said. He nodded. But you endure. Pause. Then, almost with wonder. That is your answer. And just like that, he was back. On the hill. Same as before. The wind was cold. The sky was quiet. But something had changed. Not in the stars. In him. And somewhere across the dark the watchers stirred. Because they had seen something they hadn't seen in a very, very long time. Something dangerous. Something they didn't understand. Not strength. Not knowledge. But the one thing humanity had that no algorithm, no machine, no godlike race could mimic. The will to keep going even when all reason said to stop. And now they were listening. The stars didn't speak again. Not for days. Not for weeks. Whatever had happened on that hill, it had left a mark. Not just on him. On the world. Like a ripple through still water, invisible to most, but he felt it. A low hum in his chest, soft and steady, like a second heartbeat. It wasn't fear. Not quite. But it was close. He traveled east, though he didn't know why. Just followed the cold. The wind was stronger in that direction and the night seemed darker. Like something old was waiting out there. Watching. Remembering. He started seeing signs again. Not the kind nailed to poles or posted on fences. These were older, carved into rock, scratched into rusted steel, painted across crumbling billboards in colors that hadn't existed before. Always the same words. Always a whisper before he found them. We see you. Sometimes the words changed but the feeling didn't. We remember the fire. You are the variable. Keep going. They were warnings. Or maybe encouragement. He couldn't tell. And he wasn't sure which would scare him more. He came across another survivor near a collapsed bridge. A woman with a rifle and a limp, bundled in 6 layers of mismatched coats. She didn't speak at first, just watched him from across a burning barrel, eyes steady. Testing. He didn't say anything either. Just sat and warmed his hands. She eventually nodded. That was how things worked now. No names. No stories. Just trust or not. She stayed with him for 3 days. They walked together in silence. She pointed out places to avoid, collapsed buildings that hadn't been there the day before, lakes that froze solid in under a minute and then vanished by morning. She showed him a patch on her pack. A symbol burned into the fabric. Not military. Something older. She didn't explain it. Just said, they tried to stop it. Before the shift. Who? She gave a crooked smile. The ones who still believed we mattered. Then she left. No goodbye. Just turned east and disappeared into the fog. He kept walking. The world kept breaking. He found a school once, mostly intact. Inside were desks and paper and drawings still pinned to the walls. Stick figures and suns and crooked houses. And in the gym, a spiral drawn across the entire floor in chalk. At the center, bones. Small ones. He didn't stay. At night the lights came back. Not often. But enough to know they were still out there. Shapes bending in ways the sky wasn't built for. Watching without eyes. Thinking without thoughts. He started to understand something terrible. They weren't invading. This wasn't a war. This was a test. And humanity wasn't the target. It was the subject. He remembered what the child in the cabin had said. A door. A sequence. A simulation. But who was running it? And why now? That question haunted him more than any silence. He began noticing people again. Survivors like him. Some were broken. Empty-eyed. Moving without purpose. Others still held on, still remembered what it meant to be human. They clung to little things. Music, drawings, old books. Some wrote poetry on walls. Some planted seeds in empty cans. Small rebellions against whatever had taken the sky. He met a boy who refused to speak but handed out notes to everyone he passed. Notes that said things like, "You are not a mistake. They cannot take what you love. Your pain is proof." The boy vanished 2 towns later. But the notes kept appearing. That's when the dreams changed again. No longer stars and impossible geometry. Now it was faces. Familiar ones. His father's. His sisters. His wife's. But something was off. They spoke too clearly. Their eyes didn't blink. Their mouths moved out of sync with the words. And always they asked the same question. Do you believe this is worth saving? He always woke before he answered. Then one day in the ruins of a mall swallowed by vines, he heard voices. Real ones. Dozens. He followed the sound and found them. A community. People who had banded together not out of survival, but out of choice. They had light. Not just fire but real power. Solar rigs, hand-cranked generators, and a water system made from scavenged parts. Kids laughing. Adults repairing things. A woman teaching another to play guitar. He froze at the edge of the plaza, afraid to move. Afraid it would all disappear if he stepped closer. Someone saw him. Called him in. He didn't know what to say. They didn't care. They gave him food, water, a bed. He stayed for a while. Longer than he meant to. He helped fix fences. Taught kids how to siphon fuel. Told stories when the fire burned low and the air turned cold. And slowly something inside him began to feel again. Oh. But that was when the noise returned. The low hum. Not in his ears. In his teeth. In his bones. Others felt it too. The sky darkened even though there were no clouds. Animals stopped making noise. And the ground began to shiver. That night the fire pit glowed blue. And from the woods came something tall and thin and impossible. It didn't move like a person. It bent in places where things shouldn't bend. No one spoke. No one screamed. It walked to the center of camp, looked around and turned its head, slowly like it was measuring the weight of everything. Then it pointed. At him. And vanished. Just like that. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. He left before morning. He didn't want to, but he had to. Whatever this was, it wasn't done with him yet. And if it followed him there once, it could come back. He walked until his feet bled. And then he walked further. Because deep down, beneath all the confusion, all the pain and fear and loss, he knew this wasn't about him anymore. It was about us. All of us. Something had found humanity and decided to put it through something bigger than judgment. A trial. A crucible. And it wasn't interested in the strongest or the smartest or the loudest. It was looking for something else. Something buried deep. Something no other species had shown. Not yet. Not until now. He hadn't seen the stars in days. The sky had gone a strange shade of gray, not like clouds but like static. Thick. Motionless. As if the atmosphere itself had stopped breathing. The air felt heavy in his lungs, colder than it should have been. Nights dragged longer. Time twisted. Something was coming. He wasn't the only one who felt it anymore. The messages came more frequently now. Painted across overpasses, burned into tree bark, scratched onto glass with shaking hands. Some were warnings. Some looked like coordinates. Some were in languages he didn't speak, but he understood anyway. It was like the whole planet was trying to talk. Like Earth itself was waking up. He followed the signs without knowing why. Every step he took, he expected the world to collapse beneath him. Sometimes it almost did. Roads twisted out of shape. Gravity pulsed like a heartbeat. He saw shadows walking in the distance where there were no people. He stopped calling them hallucinations. Because once, one of them turned its head and looked directly at him. He didn't sleep for 3 days after that. And still, the pull in his chest kept dragging him forward. Like a string tied to something just out of sight. Like a promise made in a dream he didn't remember. He came across a city that was still standing. Not untouched, but alive. People moved like they knew something the others didn't. Their eyes were wide and they talked in low voices, always looking over their shoulders. They had light, food, structure. But no joy. No laughter. As if they knew it was borrowed time. He didn't plan to stay. But they stopped him. They called him by name. His real name. The one he hadn't spoken aloud in months. They said they'd been waiting for him. At first he thought it was another test. Another illusion. But the fear on their faces was too raw. Too human. These weren't watchers. These were survivors. And they were terrified. A man with gray in his beard and burns along his neck took him underground. Through tunnels that hummed with strange energy. At the end of one tunnel stood a door made of metal that didn't rust and lights that blinked without power. This was built before the silence, the man said. But it wasn't made by us. Behind that door was a room that felt older than the planet. Machines hummed. Walls moved like they were breathing. And in the center, a chair. It looked like it was waiting. The man didn't ask him to sit. He didn't have to. Because the hum in his chest had become unbearable. Like it was trying to escape him. He stepped forward. And the moment he touched the chair, the world cracked open. He didn't move. The room did. The walls vanished. The sky became stars again, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Then none. Then all at once. He saw Earth from above. But not the Earth he knew. An older version. Greener. Brighter. And then another version. And another. A million copies of home, flickering in and out of existence like someone flipping through pages of a book. And in the distance, far beyond the galaxies, was a shape. Huge. Hollow. Turning slowly like a dying planet. The machine. The one from his dreams. He felt it watching him again. But this time it wasn't alone. Others had gathered. He couldn't see them. Not really. But he felt them. Pressure behind his eyes. A heat in his spine. A cold breath on the back of his neck. They were waiting. A voice, not his own, echoed through the room. Final candidate. Sequence complete. Subject in position. And then silence. For a long time. Then. You were not meant to survive. He couldn't tell if it was speaking to him, or about him. But the voice continued. You are unpredictable. Unstable. Driven by contradiction. You destroy what you build. You bleed over your own mistakes. Yet you endure. Explain. He didn't know how. He just thought of her. The one he'd lost. Her smile. The warmth of her hands. The way she laughed at his worst jokes. How she fought to stay alive even when it hurt. Even when it meant letting go. He thought of every person who'd helped him. Everyone who hadn't given up. Every fire kept burning in the dark. And that was the answer. He didn't say it. He just felt it. The lights around him pulsed. We observe. We replicate. We learn. But we have never understood you. This is the final calibration. Prepare the others. And just like that, he was thrown back into his body. The chair went cold. The tunnel went dark. He was gasping, his hands trembling, soaked in sweat. The man was gone. The door behind him was sealed. He wasn't alone. A girl stood there. Not more than 12. She had the same eyes as the one from the cabin. You saw it, she said. He nodded. Then you know. He shook his head. I don't know anything. She stepped closer. You know enough. He tried to ask who she was. What she was. But she looked up at the sky, now flickering between night and something else, and said, It's starting. He followed her back above ground. The city was gone. Not destroyed, just gone. Like someone had erased it from a canvas. All that remained was dust, scattered in the shape of buildings, and wind whispering where voices used to be. The girl didn't cry. Neither did he. They walked through what was left. Somewhere behind them, something massive moved beneath the earth. Something old. Something waking up. He didn't know how long they had. But he knew what came next wasn't up to him alone. It would take all of them. The survivors. The broken ones. The angry, the kind, the scared, the brave. It would take humanity. And it still might not be enough. He didn't expect to see people again so soon. Not after what happened to the city. But 2 days later, as he and the girl walked through a narrow gorge where the rocks were etched with strange circular marks, they heard a voice, low, cracked, human. A man staggered out from between the shadows, wrapped in heavy cloth, goggles pushed up onto his forehead. He dropped to his knees when he saw them, breathing hard like he'd run for miles. His hands were shaking, his lips dry and pale. He didn't speak at first. Just stared at the girl like she was something holy. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, They broke containment. The girl's eyes changed. Not widened. Not in fear. They sharpened. What containment? He asked. The man looked at him like he was stupid. The deep vault. Below the crust. Below even the old war tunnels. That's where they kept the real ones. The ones that didn't pass the filter. The girl took a step back. He could feel her unease. And that's when the second twist began to bloom inside his mind like cold fire. This wasn't just about humanity being tested. Something else had failed. Something older. Something worse. What do you mean real ones? He asked. The man's mouth twitched. I mean not all of them left after the first purge. The ones that didn't evolve. The ones even they were afraid of. They buried them, sealed them. But you know what's funny about time and pressure? It doesn't forget. Before he could respond, the rocks behind them shuddered. Dust fell in slow-motion streams. The ground rolled underfoot like breath held too long. Then a sound, deep and low, rumbled through the gorge, like thunder wrapped in metal, crawling up through the earth. The man backed away, shaking his head. I followed the signal. I thought it was salvation. But it was a door. And I opened it. The girl grabbed his arm and pulled him into a sprint. They didn't look back. Something followed. It didn't chase them. Not like a predator. It moved with purpose, with intent. like it already knew where they were going. By nightfall, they found an abandoned shelter built into the remains of a cargo plane. Inside were candles, bones, and writing on every surface. Some of the words were in English. Some were not. It is not the watchers who decide. It is the forgotten. Below the surface the old minds wait. They remember the first end. He stared at the messages for a long time, trying to piece together what it meant. The girl sat in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees. Her face looked older than her body. Tired. Not scared, just exhausted in a way only people who've seen too much can be. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked her quietly. She didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you weren't ready." "For what?" She looked up at him and for the first time her voice cracked a little. "To know they failed before. That this isn't the first time." He froze. "You're saying this has happened before?" She nodded. "They tried other species. Other worlds. Whole civilizations. Some made it halfway. Most didn't even get that far. But humanity, we've come the closest." He couldn't breathe. "Then why do they keep testing us?" She hesitated. "Because you're different." He waited for her to continue but she didn't. Instead, she stood and walked to the edge of the broken plane, staring out into the darkness. He followed her gaze. Shapes moved in the distance, slow, massive things dragging long shadows. They didn't belong to any world he knew. The Watchers were returning. But so were something else. He could feel it now. Not in his chest this time. In the ground. A hum. Older than language. Deeper than instinct. They had dug too far. And something had awakened. Not the judges. Not the test makers. But something they tried to forget. The real enemy. The man who had followed the signal. He didn't survive the night. They found him curled up outside the wreckage, eyes open but empty. His skin looked wrong. Like it had tried to shift into something else and got stuck halfway. They buried him the next morning. No words. Just silence. The girl left a note on the grave. "You weren't wrong. Just early." As they moved on he realized something was changing inside him. The dreams were clearer now. Less chaotic. They showed him pieces. Places. People. Voices of those he'd met along the way, repeating the same word again and again. Remember. The message was in everything. The sky. The symbols. The girl's quiet glances. This wasn't about saving the world. This was about remembering what had almost destroyed it before. And doing something different this time. They reached an observatory near what used to be a national park. Half of it had caved in, but the basement held computers, some still powered by scavenged solar. The screens were cracked but they worked. Maps. Data. Energy signatures. And a countdown. The girl stared at it without blinking. 3 days, she said. Until what? She didn't look at him. Until the gate opens. What gate? The last one. She pointed at the display. It showed a series of markers spread across the globe. All blinking red except one. That one pulsed white. It was moving. "I thought the Watchers were in control," he said. "That they ran the test." "They did," she whispered. "But even they didn't know what they buried." He felt cold all over. "What happens when the gate opens?" She didn't answer. But he knew. Whatever was coming wasn't just a test of survival anymore. It was a reckoning. And humanity was no longer just the subject of the test. It was the last line of defense. Whether it was ready or not. The wind had changed. It carried a low hum now, deeper than sound, more like a feeling that settled in the bones and never left. He could barely sleep. Neither could the girl. Every night the dreams got louder. Every step they took toward the last gate felt heavier. Like walking toward the end of something. And maybe they were. The last signal led them into what used to be an old mining facility, torn open by time, half swallowed by the earth. The steel doors had rusted shut, but something from inside had forced them open recently. Something large. Something with purpose. It smelled like burned ozone and cold ash. They moved carefully, flashlights cutting through the dust. Walls were marked with scratches, some deep like claws. Others were words and languages he didn't know, but when he looked too long they made sense in his mind. Phrases like, "Remembers? Do not answer when it calls." The last breath of the first war still lingers. The girl walked ahead without fear. He wasn't sure if it was courage or that strange calm she always carried, but it grounded him. She moved like she had done this before, like some part of her already knew how it would end. Deeper inside, the ground began to shake in pulses, like a heartbeat too big for the world. Lights flickered on without power. Walls glowed faintly. Something was alive in here. Then they found it. A chamber the size of a cathedral, hidden below rock and reinforced steel. In the center stood a structure that didn't look man-made, tall, dark, with smooth surfaces that seemed to shimmer and bend light. It looked like it had been waiting a very long time. The girl stepped forward first. "It's not a machine," she whispered. "It's a memory." He didn't understand. She pressed her hand to the surface. The ground stopped shaking. The light dimmed. And the air shifted. As if time held its breath. Then the memory spoke. But not in words. It flooded his mind with images, emotions, soundless screams, and colors he couldn't describe. A history not written in books, but carved into the blood and bone of 1,000 civilizations. He saw them, those who had come before humanity. How they reached the same point, faced the same test, and failed. Not because they weren't strong, but because they forgot who they were. They chose fear over connection, power over unity, control over empathy. He saw how the Watchers had cataloged each fall. Cold, distant, learning nothing except how to run the next simulation. But this time was different. Because humans weren't predictable. They loved too hard, broke too easily, got angry for the right reasons, made mistakes with full hearts and kept trying anyway. They created beauty inside pain. That was the variable. That was what the Watchers never understood. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't logic or power or even survival. It was choice. In the memory he saw a face, hers. Not the girl beside him. The woman he'd lost. She had once stood in this chamber. She had touched the same surface. And made a choice. But she was alone. And it wasn't enough. Now it was his turn. The Watchers appeared, not as forms but as presence. Shadows of intent, thick and suffocating. They surrounded the chamber, pressing in on the edges of thought. He heard them ask the same question they'd asked in the chair. "Explain." He looked at the girl. She nodded once, silent, steady. So he didn't try to explain with words. He opened the memory and showed them. He showed them the pain of loss, the weight of grief, the moment he fell to his knees in the forest, ready to stop walking forever. And the moment after, when he stood up anyway. He showed them the people who helped each other with nothing left to give. He showed them music played in ruined cities. He showed them hands reaching out even when it hurt. He showed them her. The girl beside him. The woman he lost. Every person he met who refused to give in. The Watchers didn't speak again. But something changed. The air grew warmer. The chamber pulsed with a soft light. The structure opened. And inside was the gate. Not a portal. Not a doorway. A chance. It shimmered with the potential of 1,000 outcomes. One path led to destruction. One led to silence. One led to rebirth. But it couldn't choose for him. Only he could. He stepped forward. And chose hope. The chamber exploded with light. The Watchers vanished. The hum stopped. And then silence. He woke up outside the facility. The sky was clear. The stars were visible again. The girl was beside him, asleep. Peaceful. He looked around. The ground no longer pulsed. No more whispers in the wind. He felt lighter. Like something had been lifted from the world. He carried her back to the surface, heart pounding in quiet disbelief. Everywhere they walked, things were different. Birds were returning. Trees that had been blackened began to show signs of green. People came out of hiding. Slowly. Carefully. Like blinking into the sun after too long underground. They didn't understand what had happened. He wasn't even sure he did. But something had changed. The test was over. Humanity had passed, not by being perfect but by being human. And just as he began to let go of the tension in his chest, just as he allowed himself to believe it was done, the girl turned to him, eyes wide. "Do you feel that?" she asked. He paused. Yes. A low vibration beneath his feet. Familiar. Too familiar. Then the sky cracked open, not violently. Silently. Like peeling back the edge of a curtain. And beyond the stars, something watched. Not the Watchers. Something else. Something older than them. Forgotten even by the ones who ran the test. A presence so vast, so immense, it made the Watchers feel like shadows. And it had noticed him. Not just him, them. Humanity. The test wasn't the final test. It was the invitation. And now, the real ones were coming. He stood there, breath caught in his throat. Because deep down, part of him knew. What they just survived wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. He stood frozen, watching the sky tear open like quiet fabric unraveling across the heavens. Behind that thin, pulsing rift, stars blinked out and strange shapes stirred, like giants moving beneath a dark ocean. It wasn't chaos. It was calm. Silent. But it carried weight. like an answer to a question no one asked. The girl stood beside him, her breath slow and steady. Not afraid. Not anymore. She had seen enough, remembered enough, to understand. So had he. This wasn't the invasion people feared. It wasn't fire or war or extermination. It was contact. From something beyond even the Watchers. The Watchers had run the tests. But they were not the originators. They were caretakers of an old legacy, one built on trying to understand what made something worthy of continuing. But these beings, the ones behind the stars, they weren't testing. They were watching. Waiting. And now that the signal had gone out, the one triggered by his choice, they were coming to see for themselves. He didn't run. He stayed. Because whatever came next, it had to be faced. The sky held that strange rift for 3 days. During that time, the world didn't panic. People didn't riot. Maybe because something in them understood that this was different. A quiet reckoning. A cosmic door, not a blade. And people adapted. Farms began growing again. The soil, long dead from war and fallout, began to shift back to life. Not quickly. Not perfectly. But enough. The girl said it was the residual energy of the gate, the echo of a world being given another chance. In the cities, the survivors came together. They fixed what they could. Built what they needed. No one waited for instructions anymore. They helped each other. They listened more. Fought less. Maybe humanity didn't pass because it got everything right. Maybe it passed because it finally learned how to stop destroying what mattered most. Connection. Empathy. Choice. He spent the next weeks in the rebuilt observatory. Not to watch the rift. That part stayed open but dormant like a sleeping eye. He stayed to help send messages across the remaining communication lines, reaching survivors still scattered across the continents. He sent out stories, warnings, hope, and he listened to the ones that came back. A small group in what used to be northern Canada had found a clean water source and was building a sustainable community. They called themselves the New First. Not because they thought they were better, but because they wanted to remember what it felt like to begin again. A scientist from the old resistance groups had found the shell of a deep earth archive. Hidden recordings, journals, and logs from people who lived through the collapse. They were working on translating and preserving them, to make sure the past wasn't forgotten. A child in what used to be Japan had drawn the rift in the sky and said it looked like a smile. And somewhere, in the ruins of a war-born desert, someone was singing again. Even with all that, the Watchers didn't speak again. They had vanished completely after the gate opened. Maybe their role was done. Maybe they had passed their judgment and moved on. The beings beyond the gate, those ancient Watchers of the Watchers, they remained quiet too. Present but not interfering. Like librarians who had finally seen someone read the right book after centuries of watching failures. And he was okay with that. He and the girl traveled less after the first season passed. She had grown. Not older, not exactly, but she was different. Softer in some ways. Stronger in others. She didn't speak of where she came from anymore, or of the chair or the facility or what she knew. She just lived. And so did he. Sometimes, at night, he would look at the stars and wonder what they were still waiting for. If the rift would ever close. If one day something else would come through. But the fear was gone. Not because the danger had vanished. But because he finally understood that humanity had something worth defending. Not just surviving for. But living for. The girl asked him once, quietly, if he thought it had all been worth it. He didn't answer right away. He remembered the loss. The fire. The loneliness. The days where the silence felt like it would crush him. But he also remembered the moments in between. The way people still laughed, even with empty bellies. The way strangers still reached for each other's hands in the dark. The stories. The songs. The stubborn, irrational hope that refused to die. So he nodded. Yeah, he said. I think it was. In the last weeks of that year they planted trees. Not because they needed the fruit, though they did. But because there was something sacred about putting roots back into the earth. About reclaiming the ground not just for survival but for beauty. And when the first sapling broke through the dirt, reaching for a sun that had once seemed lost forever, he realized something important. They were no longer being watched. They were being remembered. He didn't need the gate to close. He didn't need answers to every question. Life was full of mysteries. But some mysteries weren't meant to be solved. They were meant to be lived. And so, on a quiet morning with a soft breeze carrying the scent of new leaves and warm soil, he sat beside the girl, now a young woman, and closed his eyes. He listened. To the wind. To the laughter of new children. To the world breathing again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And it was theirs. Humanity had found its greatest strength. And this time it remembered never to let it go. The sky watched. The stars waited. But the story for now was complete. And Earth was alive again.